Hello, my name is Dr. Matthew Younglove, and I'm the professor of saxophone at Tennessee Tech University. I'm also a Vandoren Artist Clinician. Today, we're going to be talking about the early history of the saxophone, and this is a really fun topic for me to talk about, and as you can tell, I'm a nerd out here for a little bit. We're going to have some fun. So, literally, the word saxophone translates to the sound of sax. Phone, as a suffix in Greek, means sound, so saxophone means the sound of sax. Why is this important? Well, the saxophone is one of the only instruments that can trace its lineage to a single inventor. And that person was named Adolf Sax. So let's talk a little bit about that. Most instruments evolved over time. We have an actual inventor of the saxophone. Adolf Sax was born in Dinant, Belgium on November 6, 1814. He was officially named Antoine Joseph Sax, but from an early age he went by the name Adolf, so that's what we know him by now as Adolf Sax. His father was a cabinet and table maker. But at some point during his career, he transitioned from being a woodworker with cabinets and tables to manufacturing musical instruments, especially woodwind instruments and brass instruments. So, from a young age, Adolf was in the instrument shop with his dad, just sort of learning the tricks of the trade and becoming curious and exploring his curiosities and getting to work with his hands in that particular fashion. So, he eventually went on to study music at the Brussels Conservatory, and he studied both flute and voice. Later, he decided to pick up and master the clarinet, and it was said that he was such an extremely gifted clarinetist he could have made a career as a performer of that. But good for us, he decided not to do that, and he ended up inventing the saxophone. So instead of performing as a clarinetist, he kept being drawn to the workshop. He wanted to work on and perfect what he considered the acoustical shortcomings of the clarinet. So what are these shortcomings? Primarily projection issues. The bigger you made a clarinet, the harder it was for that instrument's sound to project through the orchestra. And for this reason, he decided to actually invent a whole new instrument. And it's believed the first saxophone invented was the bass saxophone because it was working to try to fill that lower section of the orchestra that the woodwinds kind of struggled to project with. So if you look at a bass clarinet, you might think that looks a little bit like a saxophone. It has these metal parts on it that look and make it kind of look like a saxophone. Well, there's a reason for that. Adolf Sax was the one who actually added the upward-facing metal bell onto the bottom of the bass clarinet. He didn't stop there. He was fascinated by the idea that a single reed mouthpiece could be combined with a conical board instrument, an instrument that gets like a cone, think traffic cone. It gets bigger as it goes, right? So he was fascinated that a single reed mouthpiece could be combined with a conical bore instrument, which would give a richer sound just due to the physics of the overtone production on a conical bore versus a cylindrical bore like the clarinet. Sax tinkered around the shop with these ideas. Some people say the serpent or the ophicleide are both instruments that were predecessors of the saxophone because they were conical bored instruments, but they had a brass mouthpiece. They both had keys like a saxophone, but just were played with a brass mouthpiece. So many people believe those instruments, the serpent and the ophicleide, were originally predecessors to the saxophone. Now, the original patent for the saxophone didn't get filed until 1846, but the saxophone had been publicly introduced as early as 1840, and there's some evidence that Adolf Sax actually invented it as early as 1838, and that evidence is in various correspondences that he wrote with different people. So this leads us to a really interesting fact. The tuba was invented in 1836 and is considered standard member of the orchestra. However, the saxophone invented in 1838, not considered a standard member of the orchestra. So what do I mean by a standard member of the orchestra? Well, if you look around at major orchestras in the United States, a standard member is one for which there is a paid full-time position. Most orchestras have a paid full-time tuba position, if they're a full-time orchestra. There are no paid full-time saxophone positions in orchestras. So why is that difference? 1836 to 1838. Was there a magic rule that came out in 1837 that said, we're done with orchestra instruments? Absolutely not. So there's actually a really good story about this. And I think it helps us understand where the saxophone is today and why its story is unfolded the way that it has. So one of the inventors of the tuba, a German instrument maker named Wilhelm Wieprecht, amongst others, did not like Adolf Sax. They didn't like how innovative he was, and they felt threatened by his presence when he relocated his shop to Paris to become an instrument maker. So Adolf Sax, born in Dinant, really grew up in Brussels. His dad had this instrument factory in Brussels. He decided to relocate to Paris because that's where everything was. That was the center of musical achievement at the time. That's where he wanted to be because that's where everything was happening. So he moves to Paris, and when he moved, he was so good at what he did, he threatened the livelihood of all the German instrument makers and who had already created well-established shops. So Wieprecht, amongst others, formed an association that worked to keep Sax's instruments out of the orchestra, and on more than one occasion, musicians threatened to walk out if Adolf Sax's instruments were used in a performance. So this led orchestra directors or performers really little choice because they couldn't have the orchestra walk out. So composers who wrote for orchestras that included saxophone or sax instruments, whether it was a saxophone or a sax horn or a sax tromba or any one of the many instruments that Adolf Sax worked on making improvements, they didn't get to be performed because the guild or the alliance that was formed by Wieprecht made it so that they couldn't perform it. They blackballed the orchestras. So this is why the saxophone continually has to prove itself as worthy of inclusion with the orchestra. And we only have a handful of pieces up until present that are standard pieces that get played by orchestras. And whenever that happens, usually an orchestra has to hire in an extra or a substitute saxophonist, or sometimes another instrumentalist like the bassoonist who doubles on the saxophone will get paid a doubling fee to play the saxophone with that. However, if you look at where we currently are with modern trends and modern concertos, I think we're doing a pretty good job of proving why our instrument's worthy of inclusion. Here's a good clip. What's really interesting is that many contemporaries of Adolf Sax, like the famous composer Hector Berlioz, actually praised the brilliant maker and his instruments. In a letter that's dated from 1843, here's what Berlioz writes about Sax in his current situation when he was being blackballed by orchestras. Quote, "The persecutions he suffers are worthy of the Middle Ages and recall the antics of the enemies of Benvenuto, the Florentine sculptor. They lure away his workmen, steal his designs, accuse him of insanity, and bring legal proceedings against him. Such is the hatred inventors inspire, and rivals who are incapable of inventing anything themselves." End quote. What a sick burn! Hector Berlioz basically insulted all the other instrument makers because they weren't as inventive as Adolf Sax. So, despite these setbacks, Sax would eventually find some success with his improved instruments. And it really, including the saxophone and these other instruments he invented, it really came down to the French military bands. So the French military bands held this competition on the Champ du Mars, and this competition was designed to reform the French military bands. Adolf Sax wins this competition. And this is one of the many reasons why, when you think about the saxophone being keyed in B-flat and E-flat, that's the family of saxophones that became the most prominent today. The B-flat and E-flat family, so you think you got the B-flat tenor and the B-flat soprano, and you have the E-flat alto and the E-flat tenor, or bari sax. Those instruments are all the ones that are really played today because they're the band family. But Adolf Sax also invented a different family of saxophones keyed in F and in C. And so there was a concert C soprano, an F alto, a C tenor, which is now the C melody tenor sax, and you might find one of those somewhere around you on sale, and then an F baritone sax. That family of instruments were all created to be the orchestral family of instruments, but they did not survive because it didn't become a standard orchestra instrument. Another fun side fact, from 1857 to 1870, Adolf Sax actually taught the first class of saxophone at the Paris Conservatory. However, the France and Prussian War of 1870 caused budget cuts, and they had to cut the saxophone class. It wouldn't be until 1942, 72 years later, that the saxophone class is reinstated at the Paris Conservatory and becomes the launching point for a lot of our pedagogical materials. So Marcel Mule was the teacher who was hired in 1942 at the Paris Conservatory, and both Marcel Mule and Sigurd Rascher did a lot for our instrument in terms of creating pedagogical materials and commissioning repertoire for us to play. Many of our standard repertoire pieces come from this particular time period. And 1942 is, of course, about 100 years after the invention of the instrument. So about 100 years of history before our instrument is recognized as an instrument worthy of study at the Paris Conservatory. It's interesting to note that the saxophone is very often associated with jazz music, but that connection actually didn't start until after World War I. So usually jazz bands before World War I, before the 19-teens, were using the clarinet as the primary woodwind instrument. I hope you've enjoyed this video on the topic of early saxophone history. Please like it if you would like additional follow-up videos to be created, and email me if you have any additional questions. You'll see my email on the slide at the end of this video. Thank you very much.